welcome, Michael. It's a great honor. Thank you very much for making the time for us at this time.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for such a warm welcome. And thank you, Justine, for being one of our hosts on this occasion. And also Anna. I express thanks to all our friends from Indonesia. I pay my sincere respects to you, and I'm looking forward to this dialogue with you. Your wonderful, varied country, an archipelago of so many islands, and our closest neighbor. So I send you my message of affection and respect. And as has become rather belatedly common in Australia, I also pay respect to the Indigenous people of this country who were so long neglected and still suffer many wrongs. Right across the huge spaces of Australia, there are many wrongs to the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islanders, and it is the duty of all Australians to acknowledge those wrongs and to work to right the wrongs. I first learned about human rights when I was a little boy. I was at a school, a public school in Sydney, Australia, and our teacher, whose name was Mr. Gorringe. Back in those days, you never knew the first name of the teacher because they were very important people. And nowadays, people send text messages to their teachers, "Hi, Joe," or "Hi, Carol," but not in my time. Mr. Gorringe. Mr. Gorringe had fought in the Second World War, and he did not like war. In fact, he hated war, and he spent much of the time telling us about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and about how unless we were aware of it and ensured that it was practiced by our country and in the world, then the human beings would go on killing each other. And that was something that must not happen. The clue to human rights achievement was, he said, to learn about the UDHR and about the fine people who had drafted it. The chair of the committee who had drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a really great lady, and she stood up in her own country, the United States, for the rights of people of different race. She was ahead of her time in that respect, and she was a great leader. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was given to every one of us in the schoolrooms of Australia back in 1949. It had been adopted in December 1948, and copies of it came to us in Australia early in 1949, and I was taught what it said, how important it was, and how we had to try to respect it and uphold it and make sure that our politicians and our parliament took steps to implement it. And as I went ahead with my education and had wonderful teachers in my public schools, and then at the University of Sydney, I came to know how Australia, my country, had many good points, but in many respects was not observing the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think it is very useful for us as human rights activists to appreciate how important teachers are. They're much more important than judges and than lawyers. They are the ones who teach us about universal human rights and how we have to try to attain them, just as Mr. Gorringe did to me. I later learned that his name was Keith. I learned that because someone picked up on a speech I made about him, and this was his granddaughter who said, in the days of the internet, all sorts of things can be discovered that would not have been known before. But she said, I'm so proud of my grandfather that he taught you about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has been with me ever since. It was with me when I was a young advocate, and it was with me when I was a judge, and when I became a justice of the High Court of Australia, Australia's highest court. And it should be with all of us because it speaks to all of us. All persons are free and equal in dignity and rights. They are the words of the first lines of the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All persons are free and equal in dignity and rights. It is not something given to you by your government. It is not something given to you by politicians or by judges or lawyers, though they may have a role in defending it. It is something that pre-existed 1948, and it existed for all persons, free and equal in dignity and rights. And when I look at my own country, I can see that we did not always observe that fundamental principle or the other principles in the UDHR. Take the Aboriginal people. We have acknowledged them, as Anna Netheim has done at the beginning, and as Patrick Earle has done. But the fact of the matter is, in Australia, we did not respect or acknowledge the rights of the Indigenous people to their own land, the land of their peoples. And indeed, that was not secured by our parliament. We in Australia have some of the oldest parliaments in the whole world, going back to colonial days, going back in various forms to the 1850s and even earlier. But our elected parliaments did not respect or protect the rights of the Aboriginal people to their land. And in fact, it was the High Court of Australia in 1992 that in the Mabo case upheld a claim by Eddie Mabo, an Indigenous man from Queensland, for respect and recognition, legal recognition of the land rights that he claimed. And after that, steps were taken in the federal parliament to acknowledge and make achievable the Indigenous rights to their traditional lands. But there are still many things that we have to do in Australia to adjust our relationship with our Indigenous people. Representatives of the Indigenous people of Australia met at Uluru in the centre of Australia and asked for a voice into the Australian Federal Parliament, a voice. And they said that should be provided in our constitution. So far, we have not done that, but I am still hopeful and determined that we should give a voice to our Indigenous people in our constitution and in our federal parliament and in all branches of our government. Take women. When I was at law school, I was taught the law, and I was taught that women did not enjoy equal rights to men. In particular, if they were married women, their property belonged to their husband. And that was a rule that lasted well into the 20th century. I never put my hand up when I was in my class. Please, please explain to me why we don't recognize the Indigenous people and their right to land. Please tell me why women are not equal in the law. I never asked those questions. And when I see law students today, I tell them, we must all ask questions. We must all ask about injustices, and we must all try to correct them. Many disadvantages of women have been addressed in recent years in Australia, but there are still silent forces that render women, in some respects, as second-class citizens. And I'm sure that is so in many other countries, including maybe in Indonesia. In Australia, when I was growing up, we had the White Australia policy. Have you ever heard of the White Australia policy? The White Australia policy was a bit like apartheid. It wasn't as detailed as apartheid, but it made it very difficult for people who were not white or pink skin color like me to get into Australia. Looking at my image in this link, this webinar, I'm looking very, very white today, but that's because the light above is shining on me and making me look very white. I should have a little light here that makes me look a bit pink, maybe even a little bit orange, but I look very white. And that was what I was supposed to look when I was growing up. I was part of White Australia. And even people who got married in what is now Indonesia to a person who was Indonesian, they had terrible trouble bringing their wife or husband into Australia because of the racial discrimination of our migration policy. We have abolished white Australia now, and about 10% of Australians in the national census say that they come from Asian ethnicity. When I was a boy with Mr. Gorringe teaching me, it would have been about 1%, maybe 2%, but now it's 10% and growing. And part of the reason that it's growing is we began to meet Asian Australians or Asian visitors, and we found that some of them were very clever and some were actually very nice. When I was growing up with my parents, next door, a family moved in, and they were from Macau in China. And my parents came to love them as it were their own children. And that was the best cure for hatred or dislike of people who are different in race or different in skin color or different in culture or different in food. When you get to know them, they are just like you. Maybe not as pale white as I am today, but they are human beings born with dignity and rights. And then you come to love them and you come to ask, why is this so? Why did we have white Australia? In my class at infant school, there was only one student who could beat me, and he was Bobby Chong. He was a Chinese Australian. He would beat me every time. He later became a professor of biology in New Zealand. He was very clever, but his family were an exception. They got in despite white Australia. And now increasing number of migrants are from Asian countries. When I go to my old school in Sydney, a public high school, a very fine public high school with wonderful teachers, I find today 50% are from Asia. And when they get up to ask me questions, they have the broadest Aussie accents, and they live in Australia with respect and with dignity. But when I was at school, there was one group, one minority, one small number of people who were never mentioned, never, never, never. You must never mention. I'm referring to gays, homosexuals, lesbians, bisexuals, and others who were disrespected and hated. And if you were gay, you had to be very, very quiet about it. And you had to pretend that you were straight, that you were heterosexual. And that was the deal. If you pretended you were straight, you would be left alone. If you acknowledged your sexuality, you would not be left alone. You might be prosecuted because there were criminal laws against gays. I understand that in Indonesia, you don't have criminal laws against gays, except maybe in Aceh. But generally, it is social prejudice, not criminal law. But when I was growing up in Australia, it was criminal to do anything about your sexuality, and you had to hide. And I hid. And that was how it was. And I think, looking back, that fact made me understanding of other minorities, understanding of Aboriginals, understanding of people of different skin color and different religion and background, and understanding of women, though they're not a minority, women are the majority, but they also suffer discrimination, and understanding of how I must stand up for my rights and dignity, just as the Universal Declaration said. Now, that was not easy in my life, and for most of my life, I didn't stand up. But now I stand up. My partner, Johan, who has put up with me for 52 years, 52 years, he insisted, you have to stand up. And I said, oh, maybe we should not do this. Maybe when I've finished being a judge. No, we have to stand up for the young people. We have to stand up so they will not be persecuted as we have been by irrational and unscientific prejudice. And so I did eventually. Took a long time, but eventually I did. But the truth of the matter is, I would not have been appointed a judge. I would not have been appointed to the early United Nations positions I had if I had not pretended I was straight. That is the truth. And that is why I believe we all have to stand up and express the fundamental principle of the Universal Declaration. If we had time today, I would tell you about the very interesting work I have done for the United Nations and for human rights on the global program on AIDS, on the Global Commission on AIDS, on the work in South Africa for equality in employment, for the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and on the work in North Korea and Cambodia, work on countries that suffered great deprivation of fundamental human rights. If we had time, I would tell you about these things. But I thought it was more important that I should begin our dialogue by acknowledging that Australia, a country with very old parliaments and with many good points and with effective democracy and legislature, that Australia has had many wrongs, and that we have to acknowledge them, we have to correct them, and we have to help others do likewise in respect of the wrongs to human rights that exist in their country. And that is why I became involved in the diplomacy training course, and have been since 1990, and with the International Commission of Jurists and with the International Bar Association standing up for international human rights that belongs to all of us. All people are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's what I was taught when I was a little boy at school, and I believed it then, I believe it now, and I have come to be with you, to share with you my journey so that you will explore your own journey and how you and all of us can do whatever is possible for us to increase the respect for human rights and dignity of everyone, everywhere, no exceptions. Women, Aboriginals, people of different skin color, and LGBT queer people. So thank you very much for having me at the beginning of your journey of 2 weeks with this course. I hope it will be a wonderful course and will leave you with many good memories of friends in Australia who express their love and respect for you and for your country.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was, as always, sort of an inspiring focus on human rights from a very personal perspective. And now we have an opportunity for you all to think about questions or comments that you might have in response to Michael's opening remarks. And I'm going to start with one while you're thinking about your questions. And if you would like to ask them directly, please feel free just to put up your hand, and Anna, perhaps you can keep an eye on that. Or you can put your questions into chat, whichever you feel more comfortable with. But we really want to hear from you about your reactions about these issues. So one thing I would like to ask, Michael, is that you gave us this sort of, understanding of your own awakening around human rights, and particularly from a very personal perspective. But if you're thinking about how in your career where you've seen change made on human rights, and whether it's a small change at an individual level or the much larger changes that you've been involved with through the courts or through the United Nations, what do you think are the key things we need to think about when we're thinking about how we have an impact with our work around human rights? Because so many times it can be difficult to think it's all just too hard. There are too many things to do. I'm not a judge of the High Court. I can't make this impact. But you've had impact at so many different levels. And so I'm just wondering, what advice would you give about thinking about change and how you make an impact?
There's a saying in English that the perfect is the enemy of the good. That if you wait for perfection to be achieved, you may do nothing. You may end up doing nothing. This morning, I heard of the International Bar Association is trying to help women judges who were in Afghanistan to get safety and freedom. But it's very hard, even in Britain, where they are based in London, to raise the money. And they're complaining about the lack of money that they have to help these women who feel that they are under great threats and danger because they were women judges before the recent change of regime. But that is really another lesson of how doing nothing is really surrendering, and that must never be done. I think the answer to your question is it's very important to teach and ourselves to practice being joiners. We must all join in civil society organizations. if we can. We must all become activists, and that can be done often in polite, courteous, but resolute ways. We must encourage the teaching of human rights in schools. We must encourage test cases in the courts. That's not easy either in Indonesia or in Australia. In Australia, it's not easy because we are one of the few countries that do not have a Bill of Rights in our constitution. We don't have that. We don't have a charter of rights in most parts of Australia that can be used in teaching children at school. We do have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is respected by Australia, but it is not enforceable in the courts. And therefore, we in Australia have to work doubly hard to get provisions in law that provide a means to teach in schools and to bring actions in court and to raise issues with politicians so that there will be improvement. So I think the lesson of my life is do not despair. Sometimes you cannot effectively move, but often you can be strategic and you can find ways to raise your voice, support those who can and will raise their voice, join civil society, and get to know people who are suffering disadvantage. I think the way in Australia we overcame white Australia and got rid of it was we started to meet people, especially Asian Australians, who came and who lived in Australia, and we came to respect them and to love them as neighbours, as friends, as colleagues. And I think getting to know you is a very important message for securing respect for human rights. Because if people have a different religion or a different clothing or look different or different skin color, then they may not seem to you to be someone who is in your community. We have to overcome that. We are all in the community of human beings worldwide, and we have to work together. And that is why this program is so important, to learn and to teach. As Patrick Earle said, by teaching, we learn, and by learning, we teach.
Thank you for that, sort of that great advice about joining in. So I have one, there's some questions coming in. So the first one is from Ririn. What were the most significant influences that pushed the government of Australia to change its policy with regard to the rights of minority groups and diversity of sexuality? Who were the main actors of this movement? And then she said, then it says, in Indonesia, there is no discrimination according to the constitution, but in reality, there is a lot of violence based on sexual orientation and or religion. So sort of, you know, what pushed the movement ahead in Australia?
I think what pushed it ahead in the first instance was the media reports in the newspapers in those days about the research of a great scientist in the United States, Alfred Kinsey, the Kinsey report. And that, when it came out in 1948, was sensational because it taught that gays were not just a handful of willful people who were choosing a lifestyle, but they were everywhere, and there were many of them, and at different times in their lives, even more people had experiences as bisexual people. And I think that raised a doubt about the theory that everybody was basically straight and that you could change your sexuality if you really wanted to. We now know that that is not true. People do not choose their sexual orientation, and they cannot change it. And if that is so, it's a bit like your skin color. Some people in some countries, even Australia, used to use ointments to try and make their skin color whiter so that they would fit in and be pale like me. Most Australians wanted to go to the beach and get suntanned and get darker, which was always somewhat inconsistent with our love affair with white skin. But generally speaking, you can't change your sexual orientation or your skin color, and it's very difficult to change your gender. Some people undergo restorative or reparative surgery in order to adjust their gender to what they feel is their gender identity. And in Australia, we have begun to be more accepting and tolerant of people who are transgender. And that is something that is happening even more slowly than attitudes towards sexual orientation. So we are on a long journey in these matters, whether it's Aboriginality or sex, gender of women, or whether it is skin color or white Australia or the rights of gay people, queer people. It's a long journey, but it has to start. And that is why it's important, if you can, to get people who will speak openly and honestly about their experience. And that is what I have tried to do. My partner, Johan, saw that. And he was originally from the Netherlands. And as is the situation in Indonesia, the Netherlands criminal law did not have crimes against homosexuals. That had been abolished in 1803, 200 years earlier. And so he didn't understand why the Australian law still punished people for their sexual orientation. And I think that my being open with Johan has been a good thing. It's been good for the judges of the courts. It's been good for society. It has given strength to civil society, and increasingly heterosexual people have given support because they realize that it is plain irrational not to acknowledge the reality of truth, as Dr. Kinsey discovered in his research, and other scientists have reinforced in later research.
And there's some comments on the chat coming up, and some of them, particularly are thanking you for your work to combat discrimination issues in Australia and more broadly. There's another more technical question, which I think is interesting. They ask about how you interpret sort of the notion of the margin of appreciation, which you might need to just explain. But I think the broader question is around, in the context of economic, social, and cultural rights, is there a distinction between perhaps how they might be applied or implemented and justified between different countries, either based on this sort of concept of margin of appreciation or different cultures?
Margin of appreciation is an expression that was adopted first in the regional courts of human rights, like the European Court of Human Rights. And essentially it said that in countries which had a Bill of Rights, which laid down fundamental human rights, sometimes some variations would be allowed in order to respect and recognize the different attitudes and feelings in different countries. And that margin of appreciation has been used to generally delay, not to deny, but to delay action on some human rights. But in terms of civil and political rights and fundamental equality of human beings, most human rights experts do not accept a margin of appreciation. When I was the special representative for human rights in Cambodia, I asked the people in Cambodia if they had understood when the Khmer Rouge denied their fundamental rights, denied the fundamental rights of women, denied the fundamental rights to education. Did they understand that that was something that was permitted because it would take a long time to get around to dealing with these problems? They said, of course we thought that was wrong. Why are you asking us this question? Of course we thought it was wrong, but we just couldn't do anything about it in the time of the Khmer Rouge. But we never thought it was right, and we never thought that there was a margin of appreciation to deny women fundamental equality or other minorities fundamental dignity of their race or of their culture or of their religion. All of these rights have to be accommodated together, and that will sometimes mean that you have to try to adjust the rights of one against the rights of others. But a very fine lawyer once said, "My right to swing my arm ceases when I hit someone else's chin. My right to express hatred for gay people ceases when I hit a gay person on the chin or when I do harm to them or to their loved ones." And that is why margins of appreciation and exceptions for cultural reasons have to have a limit. Otherwise, you are introducing a principle that some people are outside the fundamental universal human rights. And that is just not consistent with what Eleanor Roosevelt and her colleagues taught, that all persons are free and equal in dignity and rights. It's not most persons or a majority of persons or persons who are like us are free and equal. It's all persons. And that's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is all about.
There's another question on a different topic, which you briefly raised before, in relation to the plight of many Indigenous people around the world who still face problems, particularly in relation to land rights. And there's a message saying, perhaps that's the reason why I saw a tent in front of the Australian Parliament during my last visit to Canberra. And the comment says that, you know, land rights are particularly prone to serious conflicts. This is a very long question, but what are Australian experiences with this issue? And given that such a long history of the plight of Indigenous people in this country, and we are going to have a session later on, particularly looking at this issue, maybe you could just sort of try and perhaps look at the impact of a decision like Mabo might have on a country and how that might move forward and what has followed there. I mean, I know that's like 2 hours discussion, but there's a brief snapshot somewhere that you could, you know, talk about the impact of Indigenous rights in Australia.
Well, what is so shocking about the Indigenous rights deprivation in Australia is that the Indigenous people were the original occupants of the land, and they were all over the huge land of Australia. And therefore, to deny those people their land rights was not only very disrespectful to their dignity, but it was also very detrimental to their economics. They had taken away from them the very foundation that existed on which they could strike a bargain with the newcomers to Australia in order to have a proper compensation for taking their land away from them. This is what happened substantially in New Zealand, where a treaty was signed, the Treaty of Waitangi. And treaties were often signed by the British with Indigenous people in Canada, in what became the United States of America, and in New Zealand and elsewhere. But a treaty was never signed in Australia because the early explorers reported that Australia was a great big empty country, empty, which it was not. And that's why eventually the decision of the High Court of Australia by 6 judges to 1, only one justice disagreed and dissented, Justice Dawson, but the 6 judges agreed that this was a situation that rested on a fundamental mistake, a mistake of fact. Australia was not an empty continent, and it had human beings, and there ought to have been appropriate arrangements. Well, we still don't have a treaty, and we still don't have provisions respecting the rights of Indigenous people or a voice in our federal parliament. And that is why there is now a substantial and growing movement to secure respect and dignity. How did that come about? Well, it came about because some very good lawyers looked at the law in other countries which had been ruled by the British Crown and said, we must get better at respecting the Indigenous people. And they took the case, and the majority of the High Court saw the justice and legal principle that was being asserted. Essentially, they said the one thing you cannot do in the modern world is the one thing that is indisputable is you cannot deprive people of rights because they are of a different race. Well, I believe you cannot deprive people of dignity and rights because they are of a different skin color, or because they are of a different religion, or because they are of a different gender, or because of a different sexuality. And if you ask me now, do you think most people in Australia agreed with Mabo when it was decided? My answer is no, I don't think most people thought it was a correct decision. But if you ask people in Australia now, they would say, of course it was a correct decision. And thank goodness for the judges who saw the injustice of the old law and who stood up for the basic principle of equality. And so I think nowadays, I would be surprised if it wasn't 90% of Australians believe that the Mabo decision was correct. But at first it had a lot of opponents because they thought the Indigenous people were basically uncivilized. There were not many of them, and we didn't have to worry about them. And that was fundamentally inconsistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it was a long journey. It took Australia from 1788 to 1992. It was nearly, well, it was 150 years before we got round to recognizing the land rights of the Indigenous people. And still there is work to be done. And still there is work to be done on prisoners. And still there is work to be done on detainees, immigration detention. And still there is work to be done on other minorities, people with disabilities. There are many errors, and we who are the insightful, who have the knowledge, we have the duty to express the knowledge. And that is why this course is so important. This course is about spreading the knowledge. And that is why it's a great privilege for me who can tell of the past when the knowledge was not spread and when injustice was spread. That has to be a lesson for us all, and it's an ongoing lesson in every country. And people with the knowledge have the duty to spread the truth.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, because so many times that we might look around and say, you know, there are so many problems in our country, but over there they look like they're doing really well. But every country no matter its stage of development or where it is in the world, has human rights issues that it's grappling with, Australia very much included with it. So we have just one last question, because we're almost at time for our break and the end of your time with us. And I apologize, I didn't get to everybody's questions. I've sort of combined some of them. And this one is more generally dealing with the role of civil society and human rights NGOs in advancing rights. And the question is sort of noting that sometimes NGOs can be driven by focusing on issues that donors want to give to, and that your whole work in NGOs tends to focus on particular issues that will be funded. And perhaps we might lose sight of the broader purpose around that. And the question is just more about how we, the importance of civil society and how we manage that tension between, having a clear focus and also doing what will get funded and what is possible from civil society's perspective.
Well, I was the president of the International Commission of Jurists, and I am now the president of the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute. So I know the importance of funding. Unless you get the funding, you will not survive. And therefore, you sometimes have to make choices. But sometimes international funders have the experience of opening their eyes to the injustices that cannot be mentioned in countries because of cultural or religious or other impediments. So it's a matter in every case of doing what is possible, trying to keep your mind open to the things that maybe you don't see, or the things that maybe you don't feel you can mention in the circumstances at home. And I understand those things because I saw the injustice to LGBT people, but I was programmed to say nothing about it. That was what was expected of me. And if I had made a noise, I would not have been appointed a judge back in those days. And so often in life, you have to do what you can, but you've got to be strategic. You've got to be effective. You've got to find friends and allies. You've got to be courageous. Courage is really important. My partner, who was not a lawyer, he was courageous. And I was a bit quiet. I was a bit embarrassed or concerned, anxious. But he was right. And you've got to choose the time and make a stand. Because if it is in breach of universal human rights, somebody has to lift their voice. And somebody has to say, this is not right. And always remember what those Cambodian women told me. Of course we knew that this was wrong, but we didn't feel we could do much about it. But you've got to find the spaces. You've got to find the leaders. You've got to find the courageous. And you've got to find friends amongst the groups that are opposed to you. Because there are always good people. Take religion. There are always good people in religion. And they will be worried and concerned because they watch the internet. They read the books. They know the Kinsey report. They know all of the science. And there are people who will speak up for women's rights, for gay rights, for skin color, for Indigenous rights, and for the very unpopular asylum seekers, and for prisoners. This morning I was looking at the rate at which we are giving vaccination to prisoners in Australia. This is a real human rights issue. And the number who are Indigenous are very disproportional in our prisons. They are the biggest number of prisoners in Australia, Aboriginals, and they are very low in getting the second vaccination. But someone has to speak up. There's been too much silence about wrongs. And you've got to be strategic. You've got to be careful, but you've got to be courageous. And how you balance these objectives, I'm afraid I have to leave it to you. But courage, courage, courage. Very important lessons for human rights advocates.
Thank you so much. I mean, they're great words to sum up this session around courage. And you know, by having this this course, as Patrick said at the start, and as Michael has emphasised, it's about learning from each other in order to advance our knowledge and then increase our ability to think about how we can create change. And the first step in that is being willing to speak up. And you know, the very first step is joining this course. So we're all very grateful that we have the opportunity to learn from you. Michael, thank you so much for your time today and your great inspirational advice to all of us. We're really grateful for you spending the time with us today as we start on this course. We are going to take a short break now and reconvene at 1:30, I think. Is that correct, Patrick? I'll just hand it to you just to be sure I've got the logistics right. Oh, sorry, I got the time wrong. That's 1:30 my time, not your time.
Yes, so 15 minutes in anybody's time, I think, is when we come back. But just thank you very much, Justine. Thank you very much, everybody, for the very rich questions and chat also. But particular thanks, of course, to the Honourable Michael Kirby, who's just got us off to a really, really great start. I think really put the challenges out there, but giving us great insights too. So thank you very much, Michael, and good luck with the rest of your day, and also going forward in your continuing work for human rights. And I think you understand how much we all appreciate all that you do for human rights here and internationally, and more power to you. And thank you for your courage. So thank you. Go well. We'll see you soon, we hope.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you.